Hey everyone, and welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be looking closely at the life of Quynh Do,
Okay.
a young Vietnamese American woman. And get this, our only source is an interview transcript. But it's an amazing one. I
Really?
mean, packed with detail about her experience. Imagine she was only 2 years old when she came to the U.S.
Wow.
So much to unpack here. Family culture,
Mm-hmm.
what it's like to live between two worlds. It's all there. So you ready to jump in?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, let's start with Quynh's early life in Vietnam. One thing that really stood out to me was that her dad was a well-known dentist in their village.
Oh, wow.
That's not something you just leave behind, right?
No, you're right. It suggests that. They had a pretty comfortable life in Vietnam. To leave all that behind for a new country, it speaks to the hope they had for a better future. They were willing to start from scratch.
Yeah, and it's not just about the material things.
Right.
Quinn's mom made sure she learned Vietnamese even while she was learning English here. Think about being bilingual at such a young age.
That's incredible. It shows how important it was for her family to hold on to their heritage. You see that a lot with immigrant families, that effort to keep their language and culture alive.
Absolutely. Now, their journey to America, it wasn't exactly a straight shot.
Okay.
They spent 7 months in the Philippines, then a few weeks in Dallas, and finally ended up in Rockford, Illinois.
Wow, that's a long journey.
That's a lot of moving around, especially with a young child.
It really makes you think about the challenges of immigration. For many families, it's not just about getting to America. It's about navigating a whole system, finding connections, and searching for the right place to call home.
Yeah, and here's something I found super interesting.
Okay.
Quinn's mom's dad was actually an American soldier during the Vietnam War.
Wow.
That's how they got the chance to immigrate.
That's quite a connection. It shows how these major historical events can have such a personal impact. Shaping the course of someone's life, it adds another layer to understanding why Quinn's family ended up in America.
Yeah, so they land in Rockford, new life, new challenges, right?
Def
Quinn talks about living in a tough neighborhood, facing culture shock, and of course the language barrier. I can't even imagine how overwhelming that must have been.
It's amazing how resilient people can be, especially kids. Imagine being Quinn thrown into this totally new environment. But she and her family kept pushing forward, determined to build a life for themselves.
And they didn't do it alone. Quinn mentions how some Americans really stepped up, offering support and kindness. That must have made a world of difference.
Absolutely. Those simple acts of welcome can be so powerful, especially for newcomers trying to find their footing. It's all about building that sense of community.
And talk about finding her footing, Quinn thrived. Graduated from Guilford High School, did amazingly well in school,
Wow.
and guess what? She got into Yale.
That's incredible. It really is like a classic American dream story, isn't it? Working hard, excelling in school, getting into a top university. She clearly had that drive to succeed.
She did, but it makes you wonder, what was it like for her navigating those two cultures?
Yeah, I was just thinking that because she talks about being really involved in school clubs, volunteering, really throwing herself into American life, but then she also talks about how different the cultures are.
Exactly. What did you pick up on there?
Well, it shows she embraced both sides, right? She's a part of American society, but also holds on to her Vietnamese heritage. Her story makes me think about how those two things can actually work together, not against each other.
Yeah, and she doesn't shy away from talking about those differences. She compares American and Vietnamese cultures, talking about education, material possessions, even just different values. She's clearly thought a lot about this.
That's the beauty of having someone like Quinn share her experiences. It challenges us to step outside our own bubble and think about different ways of seeing the world.
And let's be real, it wasn't always easy for her.
Right.
She mentions being stereotyped just because she's Asian. Even being mistaken for other nationalities, it makes you realize how much work we still have to do, even in a place as diverse as America.
It's a reminder that those biases exist and we can't just pretend they don't. Sometimes even seemingly harmless assumptions can be hurtful. We all need to be more aware of that.
You're so right. But let's shift gears a bit.
Okay.
One thing that really touched me was how close Quinn is to her family, especially her grandmother. They live together, and her grandmother mainly speaks Vietnamese. It sounds like such a strong bond.
It's beautiful how those family ties help her stay connected to her culture. She mentions that some of her American friends aren't as close to their parents. It makes you wonder if there's something about the American way of life that emphasizes independence more than other cultures.
That's a really interesting point. And you know what else blew my mind?
What's that?
Quinn plans to go back to Vietnam after Yale to volunteer at a clinic.
Really?
She's so driven to give back to her homeland.
It shows she's not choosing one culture over the other, right? She wants to be a part of both worlds. It's inspiring to see that kind of commitment to making a difference, both here and in Vietnam.
Okay, buckle up because this next part gets into some pretty heated territory.
Oh boy.
The interview asks Quinn about the whole debate around immigration. What did you think about her perspective on that?
Well, it's important to remember this is just one person's experience, but hearing her talk about the long process her family went through to become citizens, It really puts things into perspective. It's not as simple as some people make it seem.
Right, and she's very clear that she believes there should be a process for immigration, which, might surprise some people who assume all immigrants are against any restrictions. It just shows how complex this issue is.
Exactly. There's no one immigrant viewpoint. We need to be careful about making generalizations and instead focus on understanding individual experiences. And that's what we try to do on this deep dive, right? Share diverse perspectives without taking sides.
Totally. And, even though we're just focusing on this one interview, I feel like we're already uncovering so much. It makes you think, doesn't it?
It really does. You can learn so much from hearing about someone else's life, their struggles and their triumphs. And Quinn's story is a perfect example of that.
Absolutely.
Something else that stood out to me was how she talks about her family dynamic.
Oh, yeah.
She describes her family as super close, and she credits that closeness to her Vietnamese upbringing.
Interesting.
It's fascinating how she contrasts that with some of her American friends who she says aren't as close to their parents. It really makes you think about how cultural norms shape our relationships even within families.
And her grandmother seems to play a central role in all of this. She lives with them, mainly speaks Vietnamese. It sounds like she's a huge influence on Quynh, both culturally and personally.
I think that's a really important point. It shows how multi-generational households can be such a rich source of cultural transmission. Even as families adapt to a new country, those traditions and that sense of connection can be passed down through the generations.
But these adaptations aren't always smooth sailing, right? Quynh mentions how her parents, even though they're good at English, sometimes make funny grammatical mistakes because of the differences between Vietnamese and English sentence structure.
That's a good reminder that learning a new language isn't just about memorizing words and rules. It's about absorbing a whole new way of thinking and expressing yourself. And those little quirks from your native language can stick with you even when you're fluent.
It makes those everyday interactions so much richer, don't you think?
It does.
Like you're getting a glimpse into someone's whole background just through the way they speak.
Exactly. Okay, so we've talked about family language. Now let's get into Quynh's experiences navigating those two cultures.
Okay.
She mentions feeling different even as a young kid, noticing those contrasts between Vietnam and her new life in America.
It's interesting. She describes feeling like an outsider, even within her own family at times. Like being the only one who could speak English fluently created a sort of barrier.
That makes sense. Those early experiences of feeling different can have such a lasting impact on your sense of identity. It's fascinating to hear her reflect on how those observations shaped her understanding of her own cultural background.
And she talks about her parents struggling to adjust as well, arriving with very little, having to rebuild their lives, learn a new language, find new jobs. It couldn't have been easy.
It speaks to the incredible resilience of immigrants, doesn't it? They leave everything behind, face all these obstacles, but they keep going. It's a testament to their determination and their hope for a better future.
But it wasn't all struggle. She also talks about the kindness of both Vietnamese people they met and American families, who helped them settle in Rockford. It sounds like they found a real sense of community there.
That's so important. Those acts of support and welcome can make a world of difference for newcomers. It shows that even in the face of all these challenges, there's still that human connection, that willingness to help each other out.
It's heartwarming to hear those stories,
It
right?
is.
Okay, so Quynh grows up and she starts grappling with some heavier stuff. Like, she talks about trying to understand the Vietnam War from both the American and Vietnamese perspective.
That's something a lot of children of immigrants have to deal with, those conflicting narratives, trying to reconcile your family's history with the history you're learning in school. It's not easy.
And she was surprised to find that a lot of her American classmates didn't even know much about the war, or they had these really stereotypical views about Vietnamese people. She really took it upon herself to educate them.
It shows a real commitment to challenging those stereotypes and promoting understanding. It's inspiring to see young people take on that role of cultural ambassador, bridging that gap between different perspectives.
It's about sharing those authentic experiences, right?
It is.
Breaking down those preconceived notions.
Exactly. Okay, so we've talked about her feeling different as a kid, but it's interesting, even as a young woman, she still experiences these microaggressions.
Oh, really?
Like people assuming she's Chinese or Japanese, not even recognizing that she's Vietnamese.
Yeah, it shows that even though America is diverse, there's still this tendency to lump everyone together based on race. And that can be really frustrating, especially for someone like Quynh, who's worked so hard to define her own identity.
It's those casual forms of racism that can be so insidious. It reinforces the idea that you're an outsider, that you don't quite belong. It makes you realize that we still have a long way to go in terms of racial sensitivity and cultural understanding.
Okay, let's take a break from the heavy stuff for a moment.
Okay.
Quynh mentions that she loves volleyball, plays the violin, and is passionate about soccer, or football as she calls it.
It's great to see her embrace those different interests. It shows she's well-rounded, you know? It's a reminder that life isn't just about academics and career goals. It's about finding things that bring you joy and help you connect with others.
And speaking of career goals, she's pre-med and wants to go to medical school after Yale. Maybe even another Ivy League school. Talk about ambitious.
It shows that drive to succeed, right? And it makes me think about her parents, too. I'm sure they're incredibly proud to see their daughter achieving all these things.
You know, despite all her success in America, she hasn't forgotten her roots. She talks about wanting to go back to Vietnam after graduating to volunteer at a clinic there. It's
Wow.
like she wants to give back to both the country she was born in and the country that gave her these opportunities.
It's a beautiful example of how you can honor both sides of your heritage. It's not about choosing one over the other. It's about finding that balance and using your experiences to make a difference in the world.
Okay, let's get back to some of the heavier topics.
Okay.
The interview asks her about her thoughts on family dynamics, specifically the differences she observes between American and Vietnamese families.
It's interesting how she talks about that closeness in her own family, attributing it to her Vietnamese upbringing. And she contrasts that with the more independent relationships she sees among some of her American friends. It really makes you think about how cultural norms can shape those family structures.
And she's particularly close to her mother, describing her as her best friend. It's really sweet to hear her talk about that bond.
I think it challenges those stereotypes we sometimes have about Asian families, right? The idea of the strict, emotionally distant parent. It's a reminder that there's so much diversity within any cultural group, and individual experiences can vary widely.
And her grandmother, who mainly speaks Vietnamese, seems to play a huge role in maintaining those cultural ties and traditions within the family.
It highlights the importance of those intergenerational connections, right? Those elders are the keepers of our culture, the ones who pass down those stories and traditions that shape our identity. And for Quynh, her family has played a vital role in helping her navigate those two worlds.
But, you know, even within a close-knit family like Quinn's, there's room for humor. She talks about how her parents, even though they're good with English, sometimes make these funny grammatical errors because of the influence of Vietnamese sentence structure.
It's those little things, right? It shows that even when you're fluent in another language, your native language still leaves its mark. It's a reminder that language and culture are so deeply intertwined.
So the interview shifts gears and asks Quinn about the current debate in the U.S. about immigration and immigrants. It's a pretty sensitive topic, especially these days.
It's a topic that often brings up a lot of strong emotions and different viewpoints.
And she approaches it carefully acknowledging the long and difficult process her family went through. To become U.S. citizens, she doesn't shy away from the challenges they faced.
I think it's important for people to hear those stories. It reminds us that immigration isn't just an abstract political issue. It's about real people's lives, their struggles, and their hopes for a better future.
And she expresses a pretty strong belief that there should be a process for immigration, that people should follow the rules. It makes you realize that even within immigrant communities, there are diverse opinions on these issues.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that there's no one-size-fits-all perspective on immigration. It's a complex issue with a lot of nuances, and it's important to listen to different viewpoints with respect and understanding.
And as always, we want to be clear that we're not here to advocate for any particular political stance. Our goal is to share Quinn's personal experience and encourage you to think about these issues in a more informed and nuanced way.
It's about promoting dialogue and understanding, right? And recognizing that there are many valid perspectives on these complex topics.
Exactly. Now, Quinn also talks about the impact of American culture on her life, specifically the abundance of material possessions and the emphasis on individual freedom. It's interesting to hear her perspective on that, coming from a different cultural background.
It highlights those cultural differences in values and priorities. It's a good reminder that our own cultural assumptions aren't universal. What we consider important or normal might be very different from what someone else from another culture experiences.
And while she acknowledges the opportunities and freedoms that America offers, she's also aware of the potential downsides.
Okay.
She mentions the consumerism, the superficiality, those aspects of American culture that can sometimes feel overwhelming.
I think it shows a real thoughtfulness, a willingness to see both sides of the coin. It's not about idealizing one culture over the other. It's about recognizing that every society has its strengths and weaknesses.
And speaking of cultural contrasts, she talks about something I never would have thought of,
What's that?
the difference in food.
Oh, yeah.
She really misses the fresh tropical fruits from Vietnam, says they just don't taste the same here in the U.S.
It's so true. Food is such a powerful connection to culture and place. Those flavors and smells can evoke such strong memories and emotions. It's a reminder that even something as simple as fruit can be a source of cultural difference and nostalgia.
It makes me think about all those little things we take for granted. those everyday experiences that are actually shaped by our culture. Okay, so shifting gear again, Quynh also compares the education systems in Vietnam and the U.S. It's interesting to hear her take on those differences.
It's always valuable to get that cross-cultural perspective on education. It helps us understand how different societies approach learning and what opportunities and challenges students face in different parts of the world.
She points out that while both countries have similar structures with grade school, junior high, high school, and university, getting into university in Vietnam is a lot harder, especially for people who aren't wealthy.
It's a reminder that access to education isn't always equal, and that socioeconomic factors can play a huge role in determining who gets those opportunities. It's a systemic issue that goes beyond individual effort or talent.
And she contrasts that with the availability of financial aid in the U.S., which is what allowed her to go to Yale. It shows how important those support systems are in making education accessible to everyone.
It's a good reminder that we need to invest in education both as individuals and as a society. When we make education accessible, we create opportunities for everyone to succeed, regardless of their background.
Okay, so we've talked about education, food, family dynamics, but Quynh also talks about the influence of pop culture on both American and Vietnamese youth.
Uh-huh.
It's interesting to hear how she sees those trends playing out in both countries.
Pop culture is such a powerful force, isn't it? It shapes our tastes, our values, even our sense of identity. It's interesting to hear how she sees those influences playing out differently in Vietnam and the U.S.
She mentions that her cousins in Vietnam know about American pop stars like Britney Spears. But the whole celebrity culture isn't as big there, partly because the government restricts media and entertainment.
That's a good point. It shows how political systems can shape cultural landscapes. Even something as seemingly innocuous as pop music, what we consider normal or acceptable, can be very different in other parts of the world.
But despite being immersed in American culture, Quynh still feels a strong connection to her Vietnamese heritage. She hasn't lost that sense of where she comes from.
It's a testament to her ability to navigate multiple cultural identities. It shows that you can embrace different cultures without losing sight of your own roots.
And she credits her family, especially her grandmother, with helping her maintain her Vietnamese language skills and cultural traditions. It really shows how important family is in shaping our sense of self.
It's a reminder that our families are our first teachers, the ones who pass down those values and traditions that shape who we are. And for Quynh, her family has played a vital role in helping her navigate those two worlds.
And her story really exemplifies the richness and complexity of the first-generation immigrant experience, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's a reminder that there's no single immigrant narrative. Every individual has their own unique journey, their own struggles, and their own triumphs. And Quynh's story is a beautiful example of that.
It's been a really insightful deep dive so far, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely, Quynh's story is so compelling and thought-provoking. It's given us so much to think about, from cultural adaptation to family dynamics to the complexities of navigating a globalized world.
And there's still more to come. We'll be back in a moment to explore her reflections on returning to Vietnam, the cultural differences she's observed, and her thoughts on the future. Stay tuned. Welcome back. We're wrapping up our deep dive into Quynh Do's life, and I'm so excited to hear what you think about this last part.
Yeah.
We left off talking about how Quynh manages to balance her Vietnamese and American sides, and now she talks about actually going back to Vietnam.
Oh, wow.
I can only imagine how eye-opening that must have been.
It's one thing to hold on to your heritage in a new country, but it's another to actually go back to your roots, right?
Right.
I bet it was a completely different experience.
She's been back twice, and she says it was both familiar and strange at the same time, like she was an outsider looking in, even though it was her homeland.
That's so interesting. It makes you think about how our identity is shaped by where we are and who we're with. Like, even going back home, you're not the same person you were before.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about her own feelings. Quynh talks about how people treated her differently in Vietnam because she was the American.
Oh, wow.
It's like her time in the U.S. became part of her identity, even for people who had known her before.
It really shows how our experiences, even in different countries, become part of who we are, and how other people see us through the lens of those experiences.
Okay, so beyond that whole identity thing, Quynh noticed some pretty big differences between life in Vietnam and life in the U.S.
Like what?
For example, she talks about how important family is in Vietnam, how multiple generations often live together and support each other.
That's a big contrast to the American emphasis on independence, right? Like here in the U.S., we're all about individual achievement and self-reliance. It makes you wonder if those different values affect how close families are.
And it's not just about family structure. Quynh also points out that people in Vietnam don't seem as focused on material possessions as Americans are.
Interesting.
There's not that same pressure to have the newest gadgets or show off your wealth.
That's a really interesting observation. It makes you think about how much our values are shaped by the culture around us. Like here in the US, we're constantly bombarded with messages about buying things, upgrading our lifestyle. It's easy to get caught up in that.
But even though Quinn sees these differences, she doesn't put one culture above the other. She appreciates both her Vietnamese heritage and her American upbringing. It's like she's taken the best of both worlds and made it her own.
I think that's a really powerful message, especially in today's world where we're constantly being told to pick a side. Quinn shows us that it's possible to embrace multiple cultures and find value in different ways of life.
It's about recognizing that our differences can actually make us stronger, right?
Exactly, and it's about being open to learning from other cultures and expanding our own worldview.
Okay, so we've talked about the past, the present. Now let's talk about the future. Quinn's got some pretty big goals. She wants to use her education and experiences to make a real difference in the world.
It's inspiring to see that kind of passion and drive, especially in someone so young. It gives you hope for the future, you know?
She's planning on becoming a doctor and wants to volunteer in Vietnam using her skills to give back to the community where she was born.
Wow.
It's like she's bringing everything full circle.
It's a beautiful blend of personal ambition and global citizenship. She's not just focused on her own success, she wants to use her talents to help others, both in the US and in Vietnam.
It's a reminder that we can all make a difference no matter where we come from or what our background is.
Absolutely. And it's a reminder that our actions have ripple effects. Even small acts of kindness or service can have a positive impact on the world around us.
Well, I don't know about you, but I feel incredibly inspired by Quinn's story. Her resilience, her determination, her ability to navigate multiple cultures, and her commitment to making a difference. It's all so admirable.
I couldn't agree more. Her story is a testament to the human spirit and its capacity for growth, adaptability, and compassion. It's a reminder that our individual experiences, however unique or challenging, contribute to the richness and interconnectedness of our world.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a question.
Okay.
How has hearing Quinn's story changed your perspective on cultural identity immigration, or even just the importance of following your own path?
I think that's a great question for all of us to ponder. It's a reminder that personal narratives have the power to connect us, challenge us, and inspire us to see the world in new ways.
Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. We hope you'll continue to explore the world with curiosity and empathy, seeking out those diverse voices that enrich our understanding of ourselves and the world around us. Until next time.